What if I told you some groups didn't just believe strange things? They built whole communities around them, and people paid with their money, their freedom, and sometimes their lives. Tonight, we're traveling through 5 real-world cult stories that feel like horror movies, but they happened. Stay to the end, because the last one is the kind of case investigators still talk about with a shiver. 1. The Blackburn Cult, Harmony Harmless, Los Angeles 1920s. Picture Los Angeles in the 1920s. Bright lights, big dreams, and 2 struggling performers looking for a new act. May Otis Blackburn and her daughter Rose weren't famous, and Hollywood wasn't opening doors, so they opened one themselves by claiming heaven had chosen them. May suddenly announced that angels had appeared and instructed them to create a sacred book of Revelation, packed with cosmic knowledge. Not just spiritual wisdom either. This book supposedly contained secret numbers that could lead believers to treasure, hidden wealth, even oil deposits. And once you promise people riches with a divine stamp of approval, you don't need a movie studio anymore. They crowned themselves spiritual royalty. May as queen, Rose as her high priestess. Followers began donating money and land, including a major supporter who handed over what would be hundreds of thousands of dollars today, plus a large piece of property in the Santa Susana area. There, the cult formed a secluded settlement that outsiders nicknamed Harmony Harmless. Life inside wasn't a peaceful retreat. Members worked during the day and turned over their earnings to May and Rose. At night, they gathered for rituals, dressed in robes, and performed ceremonies meant to prove devotion and unlock higher truths. Over time, rumors grew, whispers of vanishings, secrets, and a community that felt less like enlightenment and more like control. The most disturbing moment involved a teenage girl who died from illness. May convinced the girl's family that she would return to life after a specific waiting period. The parents, clinging to hope, preserved the body in a way that horrified investigators later. When authorities finally raided the property, the miracle never arrived. Only evidence of fraud, manipulation, and a belief system used to drain followers dry. In the end, the leaders weren't exposed by magic, but by paperwork, lawsuits, theft accusations, and a courtroom that didn't care about angel stories. 2. Spiritual Warrior, The Sweat Lodge Tragedy 2009. Self-help can be inspiring, until it turns into something that feels like a high-priced obedience test. This story centers on a motivational figure named Ray, who rose from small speaking gigs to major fame after appearing in a popular spiritual documentary. His message was seductive. Your pain is power, your limits are illusions, and he could guide you to a higher level of life. But there was a catch. The higher the level, the higher the fee. Participants paid thousands, sometimes around 10 grand, for intense retreats designed to break the ego and rebuild the spirit. The program wasn't just journaling and affirmations. It involved deprivation, exhaustion, and social pressure disguised as transformation. Attendees were pushed into extreme challenges, long fasting periods, isolation in harsh outdoor conditions, symbolic acts to prove loyalty, and finally, the centerpiece, an enclosed, sweat lodge-style experience. Ray insisted that discomfort was proof the process was working. If you felt like quitting, that meant you were almost breaking through. Then came October 8, 2009, the day the method turned catastrophic. Dozens of people crowded into a temporary structure not built for safety under those conditions. Heat built fast. The air grew heavy. Some tried to leave, but later accounts suggested many felt trapped, not by locked doors but by psychology, embarrassment, groupthink, and the fear of being labeled weak. As the session continued, people began collapsing. Others stumbled out, disoriented. Emergency responders arrived to a scene that looked nothing like personal growth. Many were hospitalized, and tragically, several people died. What followed was the moment the guru image cracked. Authorities didn't treat it as a spiritual lesson. They treated it as negligence with deadly consequences. Ray was arrested, tried, and convicted on serious charges related to the deaths. This case is a brutal reminder. When a leader sells suffering as salvation, the room gets dangerous fast, especially when the exit exists in theory, but not in practice. 3 People's Temple, Jonestown, 1978. Some cults don't start as monsters. That's what makes them so terrifying. People's Temple began with promises that sounded almost noble. equality, community, and hope for people who felt abandoned by society. Its leader, Jim Jones, was charismatic, an emotional magnetic speaker who convinced followers he wasn't just a preacher, he was a lifeline. The group grew rapidly, attracting thousands, including many marginalized communities. Publicly, the message was unity. Privately, control tightened. Loyalty wasn't encouraged, it was demanded. Critics and defectors described pressure, fear, and punishment disguised as discipline. Jones's influence deepened until the group's reality no longer matched the image outsiders saw. Eventually, the movement relocated far from the United States, settling in a remote area of Guyana. Jones sold it as a promised land, safe from enemies, safe from government interference, safe from anyone who might question him. The settlement became known as Jonestown, and for many inside, leaving became almost unthinkable. In 1978, concern reached the U.S. government. Congressman Leo Ryan traveled to Jonestown to investigate. Some members quietly begged for help. A small group chose to leave with Ryan, but as they attempted to depart, violence erupted. Ryan and others were attacked and killed near the airstrip, turning a disturbing situation into an international crisis. Back at Jonestown, Jones delivered the final manipulation. He claimed retaliation was coming and framed death as a peaceful revolution. What happened next became one of the darkest mass tragedies in modern history. Hundreds of adults and children died in a single day in what survivors and investigators described as forced collective suicide, with intimidation and coercion playing a major role. By the time it was over, more than 900 people were dead. Jones himself was found dead as well, though details remain debated. Jonestown isn't just a story about belief, it's a story about how fear plus devotion, in the hands of one skilled manipulator, can turn a dream of community into a nightmare without exits. 4. Servants of Thunder, Faith as a Cover for Murder, 2000. This next one feels less like a religion and more like a crime crew wearing spiritual costumes. Servants of Thunder was led by a man named Glenn, a former believer from a mainstream faith background who began calling himself a prophet. He didn't just claim to have a mission, he claimed to have the authority to reshape the world. He formed a tight inner circle, including his brother and a close associate. Their meetings were secretive, and their goals grew grander over time. Talk of taking control of churches, rewriting destiny, and forcing their version of divine order onto reality. But big visions require money, and that's where their story turns brutally practical. Instead of building a movement through donations, they planned a direct cash grab. In mid-2000, they targeted an older couple, abducted them, and forced financial documents to be signed. Then they killed them to erase witnesses. And because paranoia is fuel in these groups, the violence didn't stop there. They began eliminating anyone they believed could expose them, including people connected to their own circle. The murders expanded, not because it advanced a spiritual mission, but because once you cross certain lines, the only way to protect the lie is to bury more truths. The case unraveled when investigators discovered physical evidence that couldn't be explained away by sermons or prophecy. Once arrests were made, the group collapsed quickly. One member cooperated and testified, receiving a long sentence. The leaders faced the harshest outcomes, with courts viewing their religious language as what it really was: a mask. This story highlights a different kind of cult danger. Not mass followers, not giant millions, just a small, intense bubble where delusion, loyalty, and fear spiral into escalating violence. 5. The Ripper Crew, Satanic Panic and a Real Serial Nightmare, Chicago 1980s. Last is a case that haunted Chicago for years. Because it wasn't about sermons or communes, it was about predators who wrapped their crimes in satanic theater to terrify victims and confuse the public. A small group of men traveled in a vehicle that witnesses remembered clearly. They hunted vulnerable women, abducting them, and bringing them to a private location they treated like a twisted chapel. There, they staged rituals, less about true belief and more about domination, intimidation, and cruelty. The crimes were horrific, and the group's reputation grew with every disappearance. Rumors spread fast. Occult symbols, bizarre ceremonies, claims of cannibalism. Some of that was sensationalism, but what was real and provable was still terrifying enough. Repeated abductions, assault, torture, and murder across multiple incidents. For a long time, they survived because fear silences people, and because serial offenders often hide behind chaos. But the turning point came when a young woman managed to escape. Her testimony became the breakthrough investigators needed. Details about the attackers, their habits, and the patterns that finally connected scattered cases into one picture. Once law enforcement had names and corroboration, arrests followed. Trials were brutal, and sentences ranged from life imprisonment to the death penalty depending on the individual and charges. Even the judge reportedly emphasized how inhuman the acts seemed. This case is the dark finale because it shows something chilling. Sometimes cult-like language isn't about worship. It's a tool, a costume, a way to make evil feel bigger so victims feel smaller. So here's the question. Which is scarier? A cult that starts with hope and ends in disaster, or a group that never believed in anything except power? If you want a part 2, tell me which kind of cult story you want next. Doomsday groups, fake healers, or self-help empires. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous trap isn't a locked door. It's a voice that convinces you the door was never meant for you to use.